In the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace, where whispers carry more weight than shouts and where every gesture is analyzed by millions, a single message was about to shatter the carefully constructed image of the perfect royal family. It wasn't a scandal, a divorce, or a political statement that would break the internet that fateful Tuesday morning. It was something far more powerful in human raw emotion, from two people the world thought they knew completely. Prince William and Catherine, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, had always been the golden couple of the British royal family. Their fairy tale wedding, their picture-perfect children, and their unwavering dedication to duty had made them the embodiment of modern monarchy. But behind the polished smiles and carefully choreographed public appearances, they were fighting a battle that no amount of royal protocol could prepare them for. What started as a routine social media post intended to thank their supporters would become the most shared, discussed, and emotionally charged message in royal history. Within hours, hashtags would trend worldwide, news anchors would struggle to maintain their composure while reading the statement on air, and millions of people would find themselves crying over their morning coffee as they read words that revealed the true cost of wearing a crown. This is the story of how two of the most photographed people in the world reminded us that beneath the titles, the jewels, and the centuries of tradition, they were simply human beings trying to protect what mattered most to them. It's a story about love, loss, resilience, and the moment when keeping up appearances became impossible, and why that moment changed everything. The autumn morning of October 15th began like any other at Kensington Palace. The grounds were meticulously maintained, the staff moved with their usual quiet efficiency, and the world outside continued to spin with its endless fascination for the lives of Prince William and Catherine. But inside the private apartments where the future King and Queen of England lived with their 3 children, something was fundamentally different. Catherine stood at the window of their sitting room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. The morning light caught the worry lines that makeup usually concealed, and her shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with royal duty. She had barely slept, and the conversation she'd had with William the night before kept replaying in her mind like a broken record. William entered the room quietly, already dressed in his morning suit for what was supposed to be a routine visit to a local charity. His face bore the same exhaustion that had become their constant companion over the past few months. They exchanged a look that spoke volumes, the kind of silent communication that develops between two people who have weathered storms together and know that another one is approaching. Their youngest, Prince Louis, came bounding into the room with the infectious energy that only a 4-year-old can possess. He wrapped his arms around his mother's legs, chattering excitedly about something he'd seen in the garden. Catherine smiled and ruffled his hair, but William noticed how forced it seemed, how much effort it took for her to maintain even this simple interaction. Princess Charlotte appeared next, more reserved than her younger brother but equally seeking attention from parents who seemed increasingly distant lately. At 8 years old, she was beginning to understand that something was wrong, even if she couldn't put her finger on exactly what it was. She approached her father, who lifted her onto his lap and listened as she told him about her upcoming school project on butterflies. Prince George, at 10 years old and the future heir to the throne after his father, had been watching his parents with the careful attention of a child who was learning to read the subtle signs of adult distress. He didn't bound into the room like his siblings. Instead, he hung back in the doorway, his young face already showing traces of the weight that would one day be his to bear. The morning routine continued with breakfast around the kitchen table, a practice Catherine had insisted upon to maintain some sense of normalcy in their extraordinary lives. But even this simple family moment felt strained. Conversation was stilted, and both parents found themselves distracted, their minds elsewhere even as they went through the motions of being present for their children. William's phone buzzed constantly with messages from his private secretary, reminders about the day's schedule, and updates on various royal engagements. Each notification felt like another link in the chain that bound him to a life where personal struggles had to be subordinated to public duty. He glanced at Catherine across the table and saw his own frustration reflected in her eyes. After breakfast, as their nanny took charge of getting the children ready for school, William and Catherine retreated to his study. The room was lined with books on history, politics, and constitutional law, the tools of his trade as a future monarch. But today those volumes felt like witnesses to a conversation that had been building for months. Catherine sat in a leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where they'd celebrated good news and weathered crises throughout their marriage. Today, it felt like they were sitting across a vast chasm that had opened up between them and the life they thought they were building. William began to speak, his voice careful and measured. They both knew that their conversation would likely determine not just the course of their day, but potentially the direction of their entire future. The charity visit could wait. The meetings with government officials could be rescheduled. What couldn't wait was the decision they needed to make, about how much of their private pain they were willing to share with a world that felt entitled to know everything about them. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here they were, two of the most public figures in the world, struggling with how to be authentically human while maintaining the dignified facade that their positions demanded. The protocols that governed their lives had pages dedicated to everything from how to greet foreign dignitaries to the proper way to exit a car, but there was no manual for how to handle heartbreak in the public eye. Catherine spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. She talked about the sleepless nights, the constant worry, and the feeling that they were failing not just as parents but as people. She described the weight of maintaining a perfect image when everything inside her felt like it was falling apart. She talked about the letters from well-meaning supporters who praised their strength and dedication, not knowing that each kind word felt like another expectation they weren't sure they could meet. William listened, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He understood everything she was saying because he was living it too. The pressure to be the perfect royal couple had always been immense, but lately it felt suffocating. Every public appearance required more effort than the last, every smile felt more forced, and every wave to the crowds felt like a performance that was becoming harder to sustain. Their marriage had been built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. They had weathered the intense scrutiny that came with their positions, the constant speculation about their relationship, and the endless comparisons to other royal couples throughout history. But this challenge was different. This wasn't about public perception or media criticism. This was about something far more fundamental and personal. As they talked, the morning sun moved across the sky, casting different shadows in the study. Their conversation meandered through memories of happier times, acknowledgement of current struggles, and tentative discussions about possible paths forward. They talked about their children and what kind of example they wanted to set. They discussed their obligations to the crown and their responsibilities to the British people. But underneath all of these practical considerations was a more basic question. How could they continue to represent hope, stability, and tradition when their own world felt like it was shifting beneath their feet? How could they inspire others when they were struggling to inspire themselves? The decision, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic or sudden. It emerged gradually from their conversation like dawn breaking over the horizon. They would do something unprecedented in modern royal history. They would tell the truth, not all of it, certainly not the most private details, but enough truth to acknowledge that they were human beings dealing with human problems. Catherine was the first to suggest using their official social media accounts. The irony was apparent to both of them, using the very platforms that often amplified criticism and speculation to share something genuine and vulnerable. But it also felt appropriate. If they were going to reach people directly, without the filter of traditional media, social media was the most immediate way to do it. William was hesitant at first. Years of royal training had taught him the value of measured responses, carefully crafted statements that had been reviewed by multiple advisors and communications experts. What Catherine was proposing flew in the face of everything they had been taught about royal communication, but as they continued to discuss it, the idea began to feel less like a risk and more like a necessity. They had reached a point where the cost of maintaining their public image was becoming too high. Something had to give, and they both recognized that it was better for them to control the narrative rather than let speculation fill the void. The morning was nearly over by the time they reached their decision. Their charity visit had been quietly postponed. Their staff had been given vague explanations about a change in schedule, and the children had gone off to school without fully understanding the significance of the day their parents were having. William opened his laptop and stared at the blank screen. Catherine pulled her chair around to sit beside him, and together they began to craft a message that would change everything. They wrote and rewrote, discussed every word choice, and debated every phrase. This wasn't just a social media post. It was a declaration of their humanity in a role that often seemed to require them to be something more or other than human. The message began simply, with words that millions of people could relate to, regardless of their station in life. They talked about the challenges that all families face, the struggles that aren't visible from the outside, and the importance of honesty in a world that often rewards pretense. As they worked on the message together, something began to shift between them. The act of putting their feelings into words, of preparing to share their vulnerability with the world, brought them closer together than they had felt in months. They remembered why they had fallen in love, why they had chosen to build a life together despite the extraordinary circumstances that surrounded them. The afternoon was waning by the time they finished writing. They sat back and read the message one more time, both of them aware that once they pressed send, there would be no going back. Their carefully maintained image would be forever changed. The world would see them differently, and more importantly, they would see themselves differently. Catherine reached for William's hand as he hovered over the send button. They looked at each other, and in that moment, they weren't the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, future King and Queen of England. They were simply William and Catherine, two people who had decided that being authentic was more important than being perfect. The sun was setting over London when William finally pressed send. Within minutes, their phones began to buzz with notifications. The message was being shared, commented on, and discussed at a rate they had never experienced before. The internet, which had so often been a source of criticism and speculation about their lives, was responding with an outpouring of support and empathy that took them both by surprise. But that was only the beginning. What they had started that October afternoon would grow into something far beyond what either of them had imagined. Their decision to be vulnerable would resonate with people around the world, but it would also bring new challenges and unexpected consequences that would test their relationship and their resolve in ways they couldn't have predicted. The notification sounds from their phones had become a constant backdrop by the time evening fell over Kensington Palace. William and Catherine sat in their private dining room, plates of barely touched dinner before them, both mesmerized and overwhelmed by the response to their message. The numbers were staggering. Millions of shares, hundreds of thousands of comments, and reactions pouring in from every corner of the globe. Catherine scrolled through the comments on her phone, her eyes filling with tears as she read message after message from people sharing their own struggles. Parents wrote about their challenges raising children in the public eye of social media. Couples described their own relationship difficulties and how seeing the royal couple acknowledge their humanity had given them hope. Young people talked about the pressure they felt to present perfect lives online, and how refreshing it was to see authenticity from figures they had always viewed as untouchable. William watched his wife's face change as she read, seeing emotions flicker across her features that had been suppressed for months. Relief, gratitude, and a deep sense of connection with people they would never meet, but who were sharing their hearts in response to the couple's vulnerability. But he also saw worry creeping in around the edges of her expression, and he understood why. Their phones began ringing simultaneously. William's private secretary, Catherine's lady-in-waiting, communications directors, and various palace officials all trying to reach them urgently. The couple exchanged glances and made a silent agreement to let the calls go to voicemail for now. They needed time to process what they had unleashed before they could face the inevitable conversations about damage control and public relations strategy. The children returned from school that afternoon to find their parents in a state they had rarely seen before. Not upset exactly, but intensely focused on something that seemed both exciting and concerning. Prince George, with his developing sensitivity to the adult world around him, approached his father cautiously. "Dad, is everything all right?" he asked, his young voice carrying a weight that no 10-year-old should have to bear. William knelt down to meet his son at eye level, a practice Catherine had encouraged from the beginning of their parenting journey. How do you explain to a child that his parents had just shared their private struggles with millions of strangers? How do you help him understand that sometimes being honest about difficulties is the bravest thing you can do? "We shared something important with people today," William said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups go through difficult times just like children do, and sometimes it helps to talk about it with others who might understand." George nodded solemnly, though it was clear he didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what his parents had done. Princess Charlotte bounded over, her school bag still on her shoulders, full of excitement about her day. Prince Louis was already distracted by toys scattered across the floor, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the adult world around him. As the evening progressed, the family tried to maintain their normal routine. Bath time, bedtime stories, and tucking the children into their beds proceeded as usual, but both William and Catherine were acutely aware that nothing would ever be quite the same again. They had crossed a line that royal families traditionally never crossed. They had admitted publicly that their lives weren't perfect. After the children were asleep, they finally listened to their voicemails. The messages ranged from panic-stricken pleas to call back immediately to more measured requests for meetings the following day. The Queen's private secretary had called twice. The Prince of Wales's office had left 3 messages. Even the Prime Minister's office had reached out, expressing concern about potential constitutional implications of the royal couple's unprecedented transparency. But interspersed with the official responses were messages from friends, family members, and longtime supporters who had been moved by their honesty. William's university roommates had called to offer their support. Catherine's friends from her pre-royal days had sent text messages full of love and encouragement. Even some members of the extended royal family had reached out privately to express their admiration for the couple's courage. The most surprising call had come from William's father, now King Charles III. His message was brief but significant. "I'm proud of you both. We'll talk tomorrow, but know that you have my support." As they prepared for bed that night, William and Catherine found themselves talking more openly than they had in months. The act of sharing their struggles publicly had somehow made it easier to share them with each other. They talked about their fears for their children growing up in the spotlight, their concerns about living up to the expectations placed upon them, and their hopes for what their honesty might accomplish. Catherine admitted that she had been struggling with anxiety attacks for months, something she had hidden even from William out of concern that it might affect his ability to focus on his royal duties. William confessed that he had been considering seeking counseling but had worried about the potential security and privacy implications. The conversation continued late into the night, touching on topics they had both been avoiding. They discussed the loneliness that came with their public roles, the challenge of maintaining a marriage under constant scrutiny, and the pressure they felt to be perfect role models for their children and their subjects. By morning, their message had been translated into dozens of languages and was trending on every social media platform. News outlets around the world were leading with the story, and editorial writers were debating the implications of the royal couple's unprecedented transparency. The palace staff arrived early, their faces a mixture of concern and admiration. Some worried about the potential damage to the royal family's carefully cultivated image. Others expressed genuine relief that the Duke and Duchess had finally acknowledged what many staff members had observed, that they were human beings dealing with very human struggles. William's first meeting that morning was with his communications team. The conference room at Kensington Palace felt tense as advisors, press secretaries, and protocol experts gathered to discuss the fallout from the previous day's message. Charts and graphs showing social media engagement filled the room, but the numbers only told part of the story. "Your Royal Highness," his press secretary began carefully, "the response has been unprecedented. We're seeing engagement rates that are off any chart we've ever used. The sentiment analysis is overwhelmingly positive. But there are concerns about the precedent this sets for future royal communications." William listened to the briefing with growing frustration. Here they were, analyzing the emotional authenticity that he and Catherine had shared as if it were a marketing campaign. The disconnect between the human reality of their situation and the institutional response to it crystallized his understanding of why they had felt so isolated in the first place. Meanwhile, Catherine was having her own meetings with various palace officials. Her lady-in-waiting, a woman who had served the royal family for decades, expressed both concern and admiration for the Duchess's courage, but she also warned about the potential long-term implications of such openness. "Ma'am," she said gently, "the public response has been remarkable, but you must understand that this changes expectations. People will now expect this level of access to your private thoughts and feelings. Are you prepared for that?" It was a question Catherine hadn't fully considered. In their desire to be authentic about their current struggles, had they inadvertently committed themselves to a level of transparency that might become impossible to maintain? The thought was both exciting and terrifying. The international response was equally complex. Foreign media outlets were fascinated by what they saw as a modernization of the British monarchy. Some praised William and Catherine for bringing a human touch to an ancient institution. Others questioned whether such openness was compatible with the dignity and mystery that had traditionally surrounded royal families. Constitutional experts weighed in with opinions about whether the couple's transparency might affect the monarchy's role as a symbol of stability and continuity. Some argued that showing vulnerability strengthened their connection with the people they would one day serve. Others worried that it undermined the mystique that had historically been seen as essential to royal authority. But perhaps the most significant responses were coming from ordinary people around the world. Social media was flooded with personal stories from individuals who had been inspired by the royal couple's honesty to address their own struggles. Support groups for anxiety and depression reported increases in people seeking help. Relationship counselors noted more couples making appointments to work on their marriages. A movement had begun, sparked by William and Catherine's decision to share their truth. People were beginning to question the social pressure to present perfect lives, especially on social media. The hashtag that had accompanied their original message became a rallying cry for authenticity over perfection. By the end of the week, it was clear that their single message had accomplished something far beyond what they had intended. They had started a global conversation about mental health, relationships, and the courage required to be vulnerable in a world that often rewards pretense. But they were also learning that being authentic in public came with its own set of challenges. Every subsequent appearance, every photo, every public statement would now be scrutinized for signs of the struggles they had acknowledged. People would be looking for evidence of the humanity they had revealed, and that scrutiny brought its own kind of pressure. The children began to notice changes too. Photographers seemed more aggressive, shouting questions about how mommy and daddy were feeling. Well-meaning strangers approached them during public outings to offer support and share their own stories. The protective bubble that had surrounded the young royals felt suddenly more permeable. William and Catherine found themselves in uncharted territory. No previous royal couple had navigated this kind of transparency, and there was no protocol to guide them. They were writing new rules as they went along, trying to balance their desire for authenticity with their responsibilities to their children, their marriage, and the institution they represented. The most challenging aspect was learning to live with the consequences of their honesty. Every difficult day was now potentially public knowledge. Every argument, every moment of doubt, every struggle with parenting or marriage became something that people felt they had a right to know about because the couple had opened that door. Yet despite the challenges, both William and Catherine felt a sense of relief that they hadn't experienced in years. The weight of maintaining perfect facades had been lifted, replaced by the lighter but more complex burden of living authentically in the public eye. They were discovering that honesty, while difficult, was ultimately more sustainable than pretense. Their relationship began to strengthen in ways they hadn't expected. The process of sharing their struggles publicly had forced them to be more honest with each other. They started having regular conversations about their mental health, their marriage, and their hopes and fears for their children's futures. But they were also learning that vulnerability was not a destination, but a journey. Each day brought new decisions about how much to share, how honest to be, and how to balance their desire for authenticity with their need for privacy. The internet had responded to their tears with an outpouring of support, but maintaining that connection while protecting their family would require constant navigation of uncharted waters. 3 weeks after their groundbreaking message, William and Catherine found themselves preparing for their first major public appearance since breaking their silence about their personal struggles. The Earthshot Prize ceremony, one of William's most passionate projects, was scheduled to take place at the Royal Albert Hall, and the world would be watching to see how the couple appeared in public after their unprecedented revelation. Catherine stood before her dressing room mirror, her stylist making final adjustments to an elegant green gown that had been selected months earlier. But now, every choice felt weighted with additional meaning. The media would analyze not just her fashion choices, but her facial expressions, her body language, and any sign of the vulnerability she had shared with the world. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied her lipstick, a nervousness she hadn't felt since her early days as a royal. The woman looking back at her in the mirror was the same person who had walked countless red carpets and attended hundreds of state functions. But something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just playing the role of the perfect duchess. She was trying to figure out how to be authentically herself while still fulfilling that role. William was in his own preparations, adjusting his tie for the third time while his valet waited patiently. His speech for the evening had been rewritten several times, with advisors suggesting various approaches to addressing the elephant in the room. His recent openness about personal struggles, should he acknowledge it directly? Should he pretend nothing had changed? The uncertainty was unlike anything he had experienced in years of public speaking. The car ride to the Royal Albert Hall was unusually quiet. Normally, they would spend the journey reviewing their schedule, discussing the people they would meet, or simply enjoying a few moments of private conversation before entering the public arena. Tonight, both were lost in their own thoughts, aware that this evening would set the tone for how they would navigate their new reality. As their motorcade approached the venue, they could see the crowds were larger than expected. People held signs not just supporting the Earthshot Prize, but expressing solidarity with the royal couple's recent honesty. "Thank you for being real," read one banner. "Royal and human," declared another. The sight of such support brought tears to Catherine's eyes, but also added to the pressure she felt to live up to these expectations. The red carpet felt different this time. The photographers' calls were more personal, their questions more probing. "How are you feeling tonight, Kate? Are you doing better, William?" The couple had expected this, but experiencing it was still jarring. They had asked for humanity from the world, and the world was responding by treating them more like people and less like distant figures in a fairy tale. Inside the venue, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Celebrities, environmentalists, politicians, and activists filled the hall, but all eyes were on William and Catherine as they took their seats. Every person in attendance was aware that they were witnessing a new chapter in royal history, where authenticity and vulnerability had become part of the royal brand. William's speech that evening was unlike any he had given before. Instead of the usual formal language and diplomatic phrases, he spoke from the heart about hope, resilience, and the importance of acknowledging our struggles while continuing to work toward solutions. He referenced their recent openness indirectly, talking about how environmental challenges, like personal ones, required honest assessment before effective action could be taken. "We cannot solve problems by pretending they don't exist," he said, his voice carrying an emotional weight that resonated throughout the hall. "Whether we're talking about climate change or the challenges we face in our own lives, Progress begins with truth. The audience response was immediate and overwhelming. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, with many people visibly moved by the prince's words. Catherine watched from the wings, feeling proud of her husband's courage and grateful for the support they were receiving, but also aware that they were now committed to this path of openness in a way that felt both liberating and terrifying. After the ceremony, they attended the reception, where they were approached by numerous guests who wanted to share their own stories. A famous actress spoke about her struggles with postpartum depression. A businessman discussed his anxiety about climate change and his children's future. A young activist talked about the pressure she felt to maintain a perfect image while fighting for causes she believed in. Each conversation reinforced the impact their honesty had made, but also highlighted the expectations that came with it. People seemed to expect them to be counselors, confidants, and sources of wisdom about overcoming life's challenges. The role was fulfilling but exhausting, adding new dimensions to their already complex public responsibilities. The next morning brought a flood of positive media coverage, but also the beginning of new pressures they hadn't anticipated. Interview requests poured in from major television networks, all wanting to explore the royal couple's journey toward authenticity. Publishers reached out with book deal offers. Mental health organizations requested their patronage and endorsement. Catherine found herself overwhelmed by the volume of opportunities and expectations. During a quiet breakfast with William, she voiced her concerns. "I'm grateful for the response," she said, "but I feel like we've opened a door that we might not be able to close. Everyone wants us to be something more than we are." William understood her feelings completely. They had intended to share their humanity, but the world seemed to want to turn that humanity into another kind of performance. The pressure to be authentically vulnerable on command was its own form of artificiality, and they were both struggling to navigate this paradox. Their children were also experiencing the effects of their parents' new approach. Prince George came home from school one day asking why his classmates were asking so many questions about whether Mummy and Daddy were sad. Princess Charlotte had been approached by photographers during a school field trip, with cameras focusing on her face as if looking for signs of family stress. The family meeting that evening was unlike any they had ever held. William and Catherine sat their 3 children down and tried to explain, in age-appropriate terms, what had happened and what it meant for their family going forward. They talked about honesty, about the difference between sharing feelings and sharing everything, and about how to handle the increased attention they were all receiving. Prince Louis, at 4, understood very little of the conversation but seemed to sense its importance from his parents' serious expressions. Princess Charlotte asked thoughtful questions about privacy and why people wanted to know about their feelings, but it was Prince George's response that most affected his parents. "Are you going to keep telling everyone our private things?" he asked, his young face showing concern that was heartbreaking in its maturity. The question hit both parents hard because they realized they didn't have a clear answer. They had committed to authenticity, but they hadn't fully considered how that commitment would affect their children's right to privacy and normal childhood experiences. That night, after the children were in bed, William and Catherine had one of their most important conversations since this journey had begun. They talked about boundaries, what they were comfortable sharing, and what needed to remain private. They discussed their children's needs and how to protect them while still being honest about their own experiences. They decided to implement what they privately called selective authenticity. They would continue to be honest about their struggles and growth, but they would be more thoughtful about what aspects of their lives they shared publicly. Their marriage, their parenting challenges, their personal growth. These could be discussed in general terms, but specific details about their children, intimate moments in their relationship, and private family matters would remain off-limits. The decision brought relief, but implementing it proved challenging. Every public appearance now required careful consideration of how to be authentic without oversharing. Every social media post had to be crafted to maintain their new honest approach while respecting their family's privacy. Media outlets, having tasted unprecedented access to the royal couple's inner lives, pressed for more details. Interviewers asked increasingly personal questions, and photographers seemed more aggressive in trying to capture candid emotional moments. The couple found themselves having to develop new skills for maintaining boundaries while still honoring their commitment to honesty. Their relationship with social media also evolved during this period. They had used it to break their silence about their struggles, but now every post was scrutinized for deeper meaning. A simple photo of them at a charity event generated thousands of comments analyzing their body language and facial expressions for signs of their emotional state. Catherine began working with a therapist, something she announced publicly as part of her commitment to destigmatizing mental health care. The announcement was met with widespread praise, but it also led to increased speculation about her mental state and constant questions about her progress. William started incorporating mental health themes into more of his public speeches and appearances. He spoke at conferences about men's mental health, participated in discussions about work-life balance, and used his platform to encourage others to seek help when needed. But perhaps the most significant change was in their relationship with each other. The process of being publicly vulnerable had forced them to be more honest in their private conversations. They developed new habits of checking in with each other about their emotional well-being, discussing their fears and hopes more openly, and supporting each other through the challenges of their new approach to public life. Their marriage counselor, whom they had begun seeing quietly before their public revelation and continued to see afterward, noted significant improvements in their communication and connection. The crisis that had initially driven them to consider radical honesty had evolved into an opportunity for deeper intimacy and understanding. However, the constant public attention to their emotional state began to take its own toll. Catherine found herself second-guessing natural reactions, wondering if showing frustration or tiredness in public would be interpreted as a sign of deeper problems. William struggled with the pressure to be a role model for vulnerability while still projecting strength and leadership. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their attempt to escape the pressure of maintaining perfect public personas had led to a different but equally challenging pressure to maintain perfect vulnerability. They were learning that authenticity, when performed for millions of people, became its own kind of performance art. As autumn turned to winter, they began to find their rhythm in this new reality. They learned to be selectively open, sharing enough of themselves to maintain the connection they had built with the public while protecting the privacy they needed as individuals and as a family. The world had responded to their tears with an outpouring of support and solidarity, but now they were learning to live with the ongoing responsibility that came with that response. They had become symbols not just of royal duty, but of the courage required to be authentically human in an inauthentic world. Their story was far from over, but they were beginning to understand that they had fundamentally changed not just their own lives, but the way people thought about vulnerability, authenticity, and the courage required to show the world who you really are behind the carefully constructed images we all maintain. The winter of their transformation brought unexpected challenges that neither William nor Catherine had anticipated when they first decided to share their struggles with the world. What had begun as an honest moment of vulnerability had evolved into a global movement, but the weight of that movement was beginning to affect every aspect of their lives, in ways both profound and troubling. Catherine woke one December morning to find her phone buzzing with notifications about a trending hashtag that used her name alongside discussions about postpartum depression. A celebrity had shared her own story during a late-night talk show appearance, crediting the Duchess's openness for giving her courage to speak out. While Catherine felt honored to have played a role in destigmatizing mental health discussions, she also felt the uncomfortable weight of being positioned as a spokesperson for experiences she had never publicly claimed as her own. The misinterpretations and assumptions were multiplying. Every time she appeared tired in public, it was attributed to anxiety. When she seemed energetic and happy, it was analyzed as evidence of her recovery journey. The nuanced reality of normal human emotional variation had been replaced by a narrative that reduced her to a series of mental health talking points. William was experiencing similar challenges with his role as an advocate for men's mental health. His decision to speak openly about seeking therapy had inspired countless men to examine their own emotional well-being, which genuinely moved him, but he was also being asked to comment on every high-profile case of male suicide, depression, or anxiety, as if his personal journey had made him an expert on all aspects of men's psychological struggles. The pressure reached a breaking point during a routine visit to a children's hospital. As they walked through the wards, visiting young patients and their families, Catherine noticed that several parents approached her, not to discuss their children's medical conditions, but to share their own mental health struggles. One mother broke down in tears, telling Catherine about her anxiety and depression, while her sick child lay in the hospital bed behind her. Catherine listened with genuine compassion, offering what comfort she could, but afterwards she felt overwhelmed by the weight of these interactions. She had never intended to become a counselor or therapist to the public, yet people were increasingly turning to her in that capacity, simply because she had been honest about her own struggles. That evening, William found her sitting in their garden, still wearing her coat from the hospital visit, staring up at the winter sky. She had been crying, and when he sat beside her, she leaned against his shoulder with a heaviness that spoke of more than just the day's exhaustion. "I don't know if we made the right choice," she whispered. "I wanted to help people by being honest, but now I feel like I'm failing them because I can't be what they need me to be." William wrapped his arms around his wife, feeling his own doubts surface. They had both been struggling with the same question. Had their attempt to be more authentic actually trapped them in a new kind of performance? one where they were expected to be perpetually vulnerable and endlessly available as sources of inspiration for others' healing. Their children were also showing signs of strain from the increased attention and changed public perception of their family. Prince George had become more withdrawn at school, tired of classmates and even teachers asking about his parents' feelings. Princess Charlotte had started having nightmares about photographers, and Prince Louis was confused by strangers who seemed to know intimate details about his family's life. The breaking point came during the children's Christmas pageant at school. What should have been a joyful family occasion became an exercise in managing public attention. Photographers lined the school perimeter. Parents in the audience took photos of the royal family instead of their own children, and afterwards several families approached them to share personal stories inspired by their openness. As they drove home from the pageant, the silence in the car was heavy with unspoken frustration. Even their protection officers seemed tense, aware of how the family's increased emotional accessibility had complicated their security protocols. That night, after the children were in bed, William and Catherine made a decision that surprised even themselves. They would take a step back, not retreat entirely from their new approach, but establish clearer boundaries around their family's privacy and their own emotional availability to the public. The decision wasn't made lightly. They spent hours discussing the implications, worried that pulling back might disappoint the people who had been inspired by their openness. They consulted with their therapist, their closest advisors, and eventually with King Charles, who had been watching their journey with both pride and concern. King Charles's response was unexpectedly supportive. "You opened a door that needed to be opened," he told his son during a private conversation at Clarence's house. "But you don't have to keep it wide open forever." Even the most generous hosts eventually need to close their doors and tend to their own families. The conversation with his father helped William understand that setting boundaries wasn't betraying their commitment to authenticity. It was actually a more authentic way to live. They could continue to be honest about their experiences while also protecting their family's right to private growth and healing. Their decision to step back coincided with a troubling development in their public narrative. A tabloid newspaper had begun running a series of articles claiming to have inside information about the couple's marriage troubles, allegedly sourced from palace staff. The stories were largely fabricated, but they gained traction because the couple's previous openness made people feel entitled to even more intimate details. The irony was bitter. Their attempt to control their own narrative by being honest had actually made them more vulnerable to false narratives created by others. The media landscape they had hoped to influence had instead begun to exploit their vulnerability for profit. Catherine was devastated by one particularly cruel article that claimed to detail private conversations between her and William, presenting fictional arguments as if they were factual reporting. The piece gained traction on social media, with people analyzing and commenting on the alleged quotes as if they were real insights into the couple's relationship. "This is what I was afraid of," Catherine told William as they reviewed the latest round of coverage. "We gave them a taste of our real lives, and now they think they can just make up the rest." William felt his own anger rising, not just at the media outlets publishing false stories, but at himself for not anticipating this consequence. They had been naive to think that their controlled honesty would satisfy the public's appetite for access to their private lives. Instead, it had only increased that appetite while making it harder to distinguish between what they had actually shared and what others claimed to know about them. The couple decided to address the situation head-on, but in a way that reinforced their boundaries rather than further eroding them. They issued a rare public statement, not through social media this time, but through their official press office. The statement was carefully crafted to reaffirm their commitment to honesty, while clearly delineating what aspects of their lives would remain private going forward. "We remain committed to open dialogue about the challenges that all families face," the statement read. "However, we must also protect our children's right to privacy and our family's ability to grow and heal away from public scrutiny. We will continue to share our journey when and how we choose, but we will not allow others to fabricate our story for us." The statement was met with mixed reactions. Many people expressed support for the family's right to privacy, understanding that their initial openness didn't constitute a permanent surrender of all boundaries. Others felt disappointed, interpreting the statement as a retreat from the authenticity that had initially inspired them. Perhaps the most significant response came from their children. Prince George, who had been struggling with the increased attention, visibly relaxed when his parents explained that they would be more careful about protecting the family's private life going forward. Princess Charlotte asked thoughtful questions about the difference between being honest and sharing everything, showing a maturity that both impressed and saddened her parents. The holiday season that year was different from any they had experienced. Instead of the usual round of public engagements and carefully orchestrated family photos, they chose to spend more time together privately, rebuilding the sense of intimacy and security that their public vulnerability had somewhat compromised. They established new family rules about social media and public sharing. The children were given age-appropriate veto power over what aspects of their lives could be discussed publicly. Catherine and William committed to regular private check-ins about their emotional well-being, separate from any public sharing they might choose to do. Most importantly, they began working with a family therapist who specialized in helping public figures balance authenticity with privacy. The sessions helped them understand that their initial decision to be vulnerable had been brave and necessary, but that maintaining that vulnerability as a permanent public stance was neither sustainable nor healthy for their family. As the new year approached, William and Catherine found themselves in a different place than they had been when their journey began. They were still committed to honesty and openness, but they had learned the crucial difference between being authentic and being available. They could be genuine about their struggles without making those struggles constantly accessible to public consumption. The world had responded to their tears with an overwhelming outpouring of support, but they had learned that accepting that support didn't require them to remain perpetually tearful in public. They could be grateful for the connection they had made with millions of people while still protecting the privacy they needed to continue growing as individuals and as a family. Their story had become about more than just royal vulnerability. It had become a masterclass in the complex navigation between public service and personal boundaries. They were learning that true authenticity sometimes required the courage to be private, and that protecting their family's emotional well-being was itself an act of love and responsibility. The internet had broken when they shared their tears, but they were learning to rebuild their lives in a way that honored both their public roles and their private humanity. The balance was delicate and constantly evolving, but they were finding their way toward a sustainable approach to living authentically while still maintaining the boundaries necessary for their family's health and happiness. Their transformation was far from complete, but they had learned valuable lessons about the courage required not just to be vulnerable, but to set limits on that vulnerability when it becomes necessary for survival and growth. 1 year after their message broke the internet, William and Catherine stood together on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, looking out at the crowds gathered for a charity gala supporting mental health awareness. The scene was familiar yet fundamentally different from countless other royal appearances they had made throughout their marriage. They were the same people, wearing similar formal attire, fulfilling similar duties, but the relationship between them and the people watching had been forever altered by their journey toward authenticity. Catherine wore a deep blue gown that had been selected not just for its elegance, but for its symbolic connection to mental health awareness. Her jewelry was minimal, her makeup subtle, and her smile genuine in a way that had taken months to rediscover after the overwhelming response to their initial vulnerability. She had learned to be present in the moment rather than constantly analyzing how her emotions might be interpreted by observers. William adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous habit he had developed during the most intense period of public scrutiny following their revelation. He had grown more comfortable with silence, more selective about his words, and more protective of his family's private moments. The man who stood on the balcony that evening was more seasoned, more thoughtful, and paradoxically, more confident than the one who had sent that fateful message a year earlier. Below them, the crowd was different too. Yes, there were still photographers and reporters, royal watchers and curiosity seekers. But there were also people who had traveled great distances simply to see the couple who had given them permission to be imperfect. Support group members wore small blue ribbons. Therapists held signs thanking the royals for destigmatizing mental health treatment. And families who had been torn apart by secrets and shame had found healing through the example of honesty the couple had set. The gala that evening was the culmination of a year-long initiative that had grown organically from the response to their original message. The William and Catherine Foundation had expanded its mental health programs, but more importantly, it had become a model for how public figures could use their platforms responsibly to address personal struggles while maintaining appropriate boundaries. As they prepared to address the crowd, Catherine squeezed William's hand, a gesture that was captured by photographers but felt entirely natural and unperformed. They had learned to live authentically even in front of cameras, to let genuine moments exist without worrying about how they would be interpreted or analyzed. William's speech that evening was perhaps his most important since becoming a public figure. He spoke about the journey they had taken, not just as royals, but as human beings learning to navigate the complex relationship between public service and private growth. "A year ago, my wife and I made a decision that changed our lives," he began, his voice clear and steady. "We decided to tell the truth about our struggles, not because we wanted attention or sympathy, but because we had reached a point where pretending everything was perfect had become impossible." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many unknown, all connected by the shared experience of human vulnerability. What we learned in the months that followed was both humbling and enlightening. We discovered that honesty is not a destination, but a practice. We learned that authenticity requires not just the courage to be vulnerable, but the wisdom to know when and how to protect that vulnerability. Catherine watched her husband speak, feeling proud of how far they had both come. The man addressing the crowd was not the same person who had struggled to balance his public duties with his private pain. He had found a way to be both strong and vulnerable, both accessible and boundaried, both honest and private. When it was her turn to speak, Catherine approached the microphone with a confidence that had been hard-won through months of therapy, reflection, and conscious choice-making about what to share and what to keep sacred. "Our children have been our greatest teachers in this process," she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "They have shown us that it's possible to be honest about difficulties without being defined by them. They have taught us that love sometimes means protecting each other's right to privacy, even within a family that lives much of its life in public." She spoke about the letters she had received from parents, teachers, and young people who had been inspired to seek help, start conversations, or simply be more honest with themselves and others. But she also spoke about the importance of professional help, the value of therapy, and the ongoing nature of mental health care. "Healing is not a performance," she said, words that carried the weight of personal experience. "It happens in quiet moments, in private conversations, in therapy offices, and in the safety of relationships where we can be fully ourselves without judgment." The evening continued with performances by artists who had struggled with mental health challenges, speeches by advocates and professionals, and testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the couple's decision to be vulnerable. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when a group of teenagers from various backgrounds and circumstances took the stage to read a poem they had written collaboratively. The poem spoke about the pressure to be perfect on social media, the isolation that comes with hiding struggles, and the relief of discovering that even royalty couldn't maintain perfect facades all the time. The young voices speaking these truths created a full-circle moment that brought tears to Catherine's eyes and a profound sense of purpose to William's heart. After the gala, as they rode home through the London streets, William and Catherine reflected on how much their lives had changed. Their marriage was stronger, having been tested and refined through the fire of public scrutiny and personal growth. Their relationships with their children had deepened as they had modeled the importance of emotional honesty balanced with appropriate boundaries. But perhaps most significantly, they had discovered a new way to serve their future subjects. Instead of being distant symbols of perfection, they had become accessible examples of resilience. They had shown that it was possible to acknowledge struggle without being consumed by it, to seek help without losing dignity, and to be vulnerable without being weak. The data from their foundation told part of the story of their impact. Mental health service utilization had increased significantly in the year following their revelation. Suicide prevention hotlines reported more calls, but also more calls from people seeking help before reaching crisis points. Marriage counseling requests had spiked, and family therapy practices had waiting lists for the first time in years. But the numbers only told part of the story. The cultural shift was harder to quantify, but perhaps more significant. Conversations that had once been whispered in shame were now happening openly. Families were having honest discussions about mental health. Workplaces were implementing better support systems. Schools were teaching emotional literacy alongside academic subjects. William and Catherine had not single-handedly created these changes, but their willingness to be vulnerable had catalyzed a movement that was far larger than themselves. They had given people permission to be human in a world that often demanded superhuman performance. As they tucked their children into bed that night, the conversation turned to the future. Prince George, now 11 and even more aware of his destiny as a future king, asked thoughtful questions about what kind of monarch he wanted to be. Princess Charlotte, at 9, expressed interest in the mental health work her parents were doing. Even Prince Louis, at 5, seemed to understand that his family was different because they talked about feelings in ways that many families didn't. The bedtime stories that night weren't from traditional fairy tale books, but were instead accounts of the day's gala, the people they had met, and the stories they had heard. The children fell asleep to narratives of healing, hope, and the ongoing work of building a more compassionate world. Later that evening, as William and Catherine prepared for bed, they found themselves talking about the future with a clarity and purpose they hadn't felt in years. They discussed the programs they wanted to expand, the conversations they hoped to start, and the legacy they wanted to leave for their children and their country. But they also talked about simpler things: upcoming family vacations, home improvement projects, and their hopes for quiet moments together away from the public eye. They had learned that being authentic public figures required them to be authentic private people first, and that meant nurturing their relationships, their individual interests, and their family bonds away from cameras and crowds. Their social media presence had evolved too. Instead of the carefully curated perfection that had once characterized royal accounts, their posts now reflected a more genuine range of experiences. They shared successes and struggles, celebrations and ordinary moments, always with careful consideration for their children's privacy, but with an honesty that had fundamentally changed how people related to the royal family. The anniversary of their original message passed without fanfare, by their choice. They marked it privately, with a quiet dinner and a conversation about how far they had come. They looked through some of the thousands of letters and messages they had received, remembering the early days when the response had been so overwhelming it was difficult to process. Now, a year later, they could see the full scope of what they had accomplished. They had not just shared their struggles, they had modeled a way of living that integrated vulnerability with strength, honesty with dignity, and public service with personal authenticity. Their story had become larger than themselves, woven into the broader narrative of a generation learning to value mental health, emotional honesty, and genuine human connection over the performance of perfection. They had broken the internet with their tears, but they had rebuilt their lives and helped others rebuild theirs. As they looked toward the future, William and Catherine knew that their journey toward authenticity was far from over. There would be new challenges, new opportunities for growth, and new ways to serve the people they would one day lead. But they faced that future with a confidence born from learning that they could be both royal and human, both public and private, both vulnerable and strong. Their message had broken the internet because it reminded the world that behind every perfect image is a human being struggling to do their best with the circumstances they've been given. In sharing that truth, they had given millions of people permission to embrace their own humanity. And in doing so, they had changed not just their own lives, but the very nature of what it meant to live authentically in the modern world. The tears that had once threatened to overwhelm them had become the foundation for a more honest, more compassionate, and ultimately more sustainable way of living in the spotlight while remaining true to themselves and each other. Their story continued, not with the dramatic intensity of that first revelation, but with the steady, patient work of building a life that honored both their public responsibilities and their private humanity.